Chapter 12. Sam turned his back to the cabin when he struck a match to his cigarette in order to shield the flame from view of possible watchers inside the log cabin. Even this precaution failed, however, because a six-gun blasted into the silence behind him the moment the match flared. A bullet slapped into the ground not more than a foot away from him. He blew out the match and cupped his hand over the glowing end of his cigarette, expelling smoke, and grunted.
Pretty good shooting.
Too damn good. Ezra scrunched back a couple of yards from Sam to be out of range of shoot and continued. It didn't. It was evidence that the belligerent gunmen in the cabin were old hands at this game and had no intentions of wasting lead without a target to shoot at. Behind the thick log walls, they had the advantage and they knew it. With no light showing inside, there was nothing whatsoever for Sam and Ezra to shoot at. Backing up against the rock wall, there were only 3 sides to the cabin to defend, and Pat had said there was a half-dozen members of the gang inside. That added up to a pretty tough odds against a direct assault.
Well, we could try burning them out,
Sam suggested after smoking in silence for a minute.
I reckon it'd probably be easy enough to slip up close and light a fire under their tails before they know what we was doing.
Wouldn't help the gal and the boy much to burn 'em up along with the gang, Ezra demurred.
Yeah, you're right. I was forgetting the boy and the gal being in there with them.
Sam shrugged his shoulders and took a last drag on a cigarette.
It'll be daylight in a couple hours.
Yeah, light enough for 'em to see us for straight shooting if we're still hanging around outside.
Well, they can't get out of the canyon if we go back to where we left Pat and wait for 'em, Sam reminded him.
What'll be happening to that Higgins gal in the meantime? According to Pat, she ain't the kind that'd be happy locked inside a cabin throughout the night with a half-dozen outlaws. That wasn't something either of them enjoyed thinking about.
You're right, Sam agreed harshly. Whilst we're setting here on our butts talking things over, only God knows what them men's were doing up there with Helen Higgins inside the cabin. We gotta blast 'em out of there, Ezra.
Well, if we had us a stick of dynamite to set off under the door.
But we ain't got no stick of dynamite. We gotta think of something else. I reckon I better crawl around on my belly and size things up.
Ezra stayed behind while Sam crept forward to listen in on the situation. This was the sort of thing Sam excelled at. He could move through the night as noiselessly as a mountain lion stalking its prey, and he had an uncanny ability to see through darkness that was impenetrable to ordinary men. Ezra, on the other hand, was perfectly aware of his own limitations. He was the type who always stumbled at the critical moment, who could be depended upon to step on a dry branch or dislodge a rock when absolute silence was necessary. He was content to let Sam do the examining and the planning. His time would come when there would be a plan ready to put into execution, which would make use of his enormous strength and his complete lack of fear. On his hands and knees, Sam proceeded slowly and cautiously towards the dark cabin. When he reached the front doorstep, he squatted back on his haunches and listened intently. Not a sound came from inside the log cabin. It appeared to be completely deserted, almost absolutely harmless. Yet he knew there were 6 desperate men inside, waiting for the slightest sound that would indicate the position of their attackers. Such absolute silence under those trying conditions indicated a high degree of discipline among the members of the gang. It was a battle of nerves with time working for those cooped up inside the cabin. After listening intently for a moment, Sam began a careful circuit of the cabin, feeling his way along the bottom logs set in the solid rock foundation. Not a sound had reached his ears by the time he had stopped abruptly by the rock cleft in the rear. There was no room for a man's body to squeeze between the rear wall and the cabin, so Sam was forced to retrace his steps around the front of the cabin. He was halfway around the other side when he stopped abruptly, hearing the unmistakable clink of iron against iron inside the cabin. It was followed by a muffled oath, and then a low voice demanded, "What you doing with the stove?" There was another faint click, and a voice responded, "I don't see no use in freezing while there's plenty of dry wood. I figured on building up the fire and heating up the coffee pot." "All right, but get back to your window soon so you can get the stove fired up. I don't like this thing of nothing happening outside. I figure they're up to something, so we gotta keep watch every minute." Sam slithered away from the cabin and back to Ezra, completely satisfied. Nerves were beginning to wear thin inside the cabin as a constant vigilance was kept. The girl would be fairly safe as long as her captors were kept on tiptoe to ward off an unexpected attack. "Figure something out?" Ezra asked in a loud whisper as Sam approached him. "I think I got an angle," admitted Sam. "Come on with me and let's prowl the corral in the barn." "What for?" Ezra moved off his side willingly enough. "Gotta find us a couple tow sacks. If they don't feed their horses oats, maybe we can cut up a saddle blanket, so that'll do the trick." "What trick?" They were reaching the edge of the corral and were feeling around the ground for a discarded grain sack. Sam repeated the conversation he had overheard from inside the cabin.
"Which means they'll be making a roaring fire in the stove pretty soon. If we can make out to stuff up the chimney, it might be mighty unhealthy for them fellers inside. The smoke will get thick enough they'll come tumbling out like rats out of a hole."
"All they gotta do is put out the fire that starts smoking," Ezra objected.
Sam snorted loudly. "How you gonna put out a wood fire when it's going good? You gonna pour water on it? That'll make it smoke all the more."
"Even if it does work, it'll be just as bad on the gal and Ben Andrews as the gang."
"Supposing you shut up and let me do the brain work," Sam suggested. "I thought of all them things way ahead of you. It won't hurt the boy and the gal to get smoked up some. Won't hurt none of 'em staying inside long enough to get floundered on smoke. Here's an old sack. It'll do the job good."
Sam ended with satisfaction.
"Now all we gotta do is figure out a way to get this stuffed in the chimney and how to handle them 6 men when they come busting out."
"You crawl up and stuff the chimney, and I'll stand by the door and take 'em one by one as they come out."
"Only trouble with that is they won't come all out one by one. It ain't likely they'll be so accommodating they'll come out with a bunch of 6-gun spouting lead. And you better get 2 or 3 of them, but even you couldn't do better than that."
"Well, I can try," said Ezra.
"Sure you can try, you lunk-headed ape. But trying ain't gonna do us no good. We gotta fix it so none of 'em gets away to warn off others in town."
"Well, we might spread a wide loop over the door to catch 'em all together when they come busting out. There's a nice tall aspen about 10 feet back at the door. Bend that down with the loop tied around it, and let her go when they're all in the loop. Remember how we caught jackrabbits that time when we was holed up in the mountains without nothing to eat?"
"By gosh, I do believe you've pappyed an idea for once in your life."
Sam stopped in his tracks to stare at his hulking partner in amazed awe.
"Maybe you better off doing some more brain work for a change."
"Oh, shucks, it ain't nothing much. I get lots of ideas just as good, but you never ask me what I think."
"Never know what that you could think before. Come on, let's take a look at that aspen tree."
They moved towards the doorway cautiously, stooping down beside a smooth-trunked aspen approximately 10 inches in diameter at the base. Sam nodded approvingly as he caressed the smooth tree, and he whispered,
"This'll do a job slick if we can get her bent far enough at the top."
Ezra suggested, sotto-voiced, "Maybe I could climb up and bend her down, drop a rope to the ground so you could tie her tight." Ezra shook his head.
I knowed you was shot through your wad when you had that idea. You ain't as heavy as 6 men. Far as your weight would bend wouldn't be enough to jerk all 6 off the ground at once.
He stepped back with his hands on his hips to study the situation, and he mused.
If we could get a rope tied up there where the branches start, and then loop it around something solid to the ground like a pulley, then the other end around a saddle horn, we could get pressure on it that way to stretch the top all the way over.
Sam's voice trailed off as he moved aside swiftly to inspect an old pine stump 20 feet from the base of the aspen. Ezra waited patiently for Sam to figure it out. He had never known Sam to fail. Sam came back and drew him towards the horses triumphantly.
I believe that stump will do her. You tie a short loop of tie rope around it and run one rope through the loop and up to the lower branches of the aspen. That'll give us some leverage when we put a horse on the other end of the rope.
Ezra only stood dimly about leverages and such, but he was perfectly willing to be shown by Sam. They took both their coiled 40-foot larettes from their saddles, and Sam cut off a 5-foot length from his, which he tied securely around the base of the stump, leaving a small loop above the stump through which he threaded the uncut lariat. He then tied the coiled rope over his arm and approached the aspen, started climbing it with the agility of a monkey while Ezra sat on the stump and watched him go up. An occasional spark could be seen drifting upwards in the darkness from the cabin chimney, which indicated that a blazing fire was going in the stove inside, and the time was approaching fast when their plan would have to be put into execution. After attaching one end of the rope firmly to the aspen trunk some 20 feet from the ground, Sam slid back to the earth and brought the slack to the stump, which he drew through the rope loop that was to serve as a ground pulley. Ezra understood his plan suddenly, and without further explanation, by putting pressure on the free end of the rope, it could be drawn through the loop on the stump, forcing the aspen trunk downwards in the form of a bow. He trotted to his horse and mounted, rode back close enough to the stump to knot the loose end around a saddle horn.
Take it easy, Sam directed in a low tone. I'll stand here at the stump and tell you when she's pulled down low enough. Then you take the slack off. I'll tie her so she can't go back.
Ezra turned his horse away and let him into a pull gradually. The animal was trained to keep a tight rope from the saddle horn to a thrown steer, and as soon as he felt pressure on the girth, he leaned into the job like a willing draft horse leans into the collar. The aspen creaked protestingly as the trunk was inadvertently bent earthward, and Ezra chuckled to himself as he envisioned the worried guesswork of the men inside the cabin as they listened to the queer sound. They wouldn't know what the hell was coming off, he thought happily. Unable to see anything, they could only stay behind the barred door and wait. His horse was straining and panting, digging into the ground for a foothold as the strain on the rope became greater and greater. Ezra could hear the girth and the latigo straps creaking protestingly under him. He momentarily expected something to give way as he strained his ears for Sam to command to stop. At last it came, a low-voiced "Whoa!" from the darkness behind him. He spoke quietly to his straining horse, easing him forward gently until he felt the pressure give way as Sam had the knot made fast on the stump. Ezra swung off and walked back to join Sam, grinning wildly. The aspen was bent almost to the ground in a perfect arc, held in that position by a rope tied to the stump. The rope twanged like a tight guy wire when he touched it with his fingers. Sam was busy laying out a large loop of the other rope and measuring the length that would allow the loop to be suspended above the door frame with the other end tied to the bowed aspen. When everything was in readiness, a perfect trap was set with a loop hung over the doorway waist high, where it would be sure to encircle the members of the gang as they rushed out, and the other end attached to the top of the aspen so it would jerk high in the air the moment the strained rope was cut.
Neatest job as we ever did on a rabbit trap,
Sam exulted as he dropped down to the stump to rest a moment before going on with his part of the plan.
You set right here with your rope out and ready to cut the rope. You let 'em hit that loop solid and try to get it all of them before you cut the rope to jerk 'em up. If it does miss one or two, I reckon you can handle them."
"I'll take care of this end," Ezra promised. "You go get that chimney stuffed up tight."
Sam nodded and slipped away into the darkness as silent as a ghost. Ezra got out his pocket knife and opened the long blade, testing its keenness with the callous ball of his thumb. It was sharp enough to shave a man. The slightest pressure of the blade against the rope would sever the straining fibre. Ezra crossed his knees comfortably and waited for something to happen. There was quite a number of sparks flying out the chimney now. He couldn't see anything of Sam, and he couldn't hear a sound, but all at once the sparks stopped coming out of the chimney. He knew Sam must have scaled the cliff and gotten on the roof and stuffed his sack in down into the chimney. Ezra tensed and gently laid the edge of his knife on top of the rope. One downward slash would suffice. He wondered how long it would take to smolder the men out. Sweat stood on his forehead and his single eye was fixed unwaveringly on the front door. It was up to him to do his part just right. A moment too soon would spring the trap before all were in the noose. A moment too late would allow some of the men to duck out of the loop before it tightened and jerked them off their feet to dangle helplessly in the air. Nothing happened. No sparks had come from the chimney in a long time. At least 10 minutes, it seemed to Ezra. And then he began to hear angry sounds emanating from the hitherto silent cabin. The smoke must be getting thick. He heard a loud banging and knew they must be trying to open the wooden window shutters. He worried about that for a moment. Would that allow enough smoke to escape so that they could stay inside without smothering? They might be hanging their heads out the window. He drew his gun and blasted a shot at one of the windows just to discourage any such action. The infuriating shouts inside the cabin grew louder. Sounded like they were fighting amongst themselves. Might be their leader, urging them to stay inside and swallow some smoke. The banging of iron stove lids was added to the general uproar. That would be some fool trying to put out the fire, Ezra judged. If he doused it with water, the smoke would immediately get worse. Then there was a sudden silence, almost like they all died at once. The silence endured for a full 2 minutes. The front door was suddenly slammed open, and men came tumbling out. The first one surged into the lower edge of the loop and pulled it away from the door frame. It was too dark for Ezra to see if all were caught in the trap, but he took a chance and slashed the rope. The released aspen trunk zinged loudly as it sprang free and righted itself upright. A great, frightened shout came up from the 6 men caught in the loop and jerked upward from the ground. Ezra trotted forward with gun drawn, a wolfish grin, drawing his lips away from his teeth. Sam darted around the corner of the house to join Ezra as he stood on his tiptoes and began mercilessly to pistol whip the screaming and helpless men swinging in a great mass 6 feet above the ground. Sam jumped into the unequal fray with his own long-barreled .45, and in a full few minutes it was over. The 6 gunmen were thoroughly beaten and helpless, and when Sam cut them down, Ezra pounced upon them, who were still conscious, and swiftly tousled their arms behind them, laying them aside in a row like 6-foot lengths of stove wood, with no more fight left in them in the same number of fireplace logs. While Ezra was finishing up, Sam dashed inside the cabin, muttering, "I stayed on the roof till they come out and unstopped the chimney. I reckon it's clear enough to look for Andrews and that Higgins gal." Ezra was finished tying up the members of the gang and was just straightening up when Sam came trotting back with the astonishing unwelcome news that he was unable to find any trace of either boy or girl. "They ain't inside the cabin," Sam panted. Ezra said, "Hell's you say," and sat down on the ground suddenly. All that worrying about rescuing the pair, and now they had vanished. What in the hell was the use of trying to help people that weren't even there? End of chapter 12.